Welcome everyone who's here tonight virtually with us. This is a program on connecting astrology and data science. This is a program presented by Loudoun County Public Library System. My name is Jeremy Worley and I'll be your virtual host today. For the people who are attending this program virtually, please feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen, and at the end of the presentation we'll have a quick Q&A. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexander Boxer. Dr. Boxer has a doctorate in physics from MIT, a master's degree in the history of science from Oxford, and a bachelor in classical literature from Yale. His technical research has appeared in journals such as Nature Physics. He currently works as a senior scientist at a small technology company just outside of DC. In his spare time, he's an active member of Atlas Obscura as a DC-based field agent. He's also written the excellent book, A Scheme of Heaven, which he will be talking about tonight. Thanks for being here, Dr. Boxer.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. And unfortunately, I'm no longer local. I no longer work at a small company outside of DC, but I'm actually here in St. Louis, but miss DC very much. So thank you for being here. My talk is called Astrology, Data Science of the Ancient World, Lessons from the Past About Predicting the Future. All right, so first, this occasionally causes some confusion. The book has two different subtitles depending on whether you come across the US version or the UK version. Each one is, the US version is The History of Astrology and the Search for Our Destiny in Data. The UK version is Astrology and the Birth of Science. I like both subtitles. Both subtitles convey, an aspiration of what I hope the book is about. But if people ask me to describe the book in one sentence, I usually just say it's a curious skeptic's guide to astrology as told from a data science perspective. So the basic premise of the book is that astrology, at least ancient astrology, it can be thought of as humanity's original data science. And so changing how we think about the past, of course, can change how we think about the present. So I write that astrology was the ancient world's most ambitious applied mathematics problem, a grand data analysis enterprise sustained for centuries by some of history's most brilliant minds, from Ptolemy to Al-Kindi to Kepler. Just consider that for much of the last 2,000 years, the word mathematician or mathematicus simply meant an astrologer. There was no distinction. And when you sort of rethink what astrology actually was for so much of history, it kind of frames the present in a slightly different way. So I write that astrologers were the quants and data scientists of their day, and those of us who are enthusiastic about the promise of numerical data to unlock the secrets of ourselves and our world would do well simply to acknowledge that others have come this way before. So that's the general idea of the book, is sort of really just to tell this untold story of astrology is, instead of being off to the side in the history of science, to actually be really central. It's actually entirely focused on the interplay of science and mathematics, two things that we tend to think of as being completely connected, but there's, a complex interplay between the two, and of course, data. And I really think that as we enter this, this modern age of algorithms and data, many of which, of course, are designed to predict the future, it's nice to revisit or to just think that we've been here before. So I think the book has, it often sort of, it confused everyone I knew when I wrote it. And I think it confuses a lot of people kind of what the book is. So the book is meant to be a history of science. I like to think of it as the greatest history of science story you've never been told. And maybe if you are familiar with the wonderful book Longitude, sort of it's meant to be a pop history of science in that vein. It's also meant to be a pop sci look at forecasting algorithms, kind of in a similar vein to Nate Silver's Signal and the Noise, kind of reflecting on the role that forecasting data and algorithms play in our life and have played in the past. What this book is not is it's not an astrology book. I am not an astrologer. I do not believe in astrology, whatever that means. I find astrology, certainly from a historical point of view, fascinating. And I was also interested in testing certain astrological claims using modern data and what we do in the book. And I pursued this with an open mind, but nothing that I have seen provides any evidence that astrology can predict the future. But of course, that's sort of my view about modern algorithms too, that we're not that much better and many times much worse in predicting the future. But the story, I think, is a story that I hope is a very human story in the sense that I feel like instead of looking back at the past and thinking, my gosh, they were so silly back then and we're so much more clever now, that really we're all part of the same story of, being interested in the same types of questions and honestly using the same techniques to try to understand who we are and what our future is. And also this story of how numbers can be extremely seductive. Numbers, charts, and figures can be extremely seductive, and that this is really nothing new. So it is not an astrology book, and I think I think quite a lot of the readership of my book, which makes sense, has been an astrology readership, and I just I don't exactly support astrology, although I try to be as sympathetic to it as I can. So who am I? So actually, the introduction summed it up pretty well. I have a background in physics, a PhD from MIT, of history and science, and of classical languages. But I was very excited to give this chat because for 10 years, I was a district dweller in both Northwest and Southwest, working primarily in the defense world. And about 2020, actually right before the pandemic hit, my family, my wife and children and I, we moved out to St. Louis, and I'm now the principal data scientist at a freight routing and optimization startup, where in fact one of the main things I do is forecasting, demand forecasting. So what motivated this book? So actually, there's a lot of DC connections in the book, but one of them was I basically started the idea of this book around 2016, and I think a lot of us, of course, remember very well one of the most spectacular failures of forecasting, which was the presidential election of 2016. But what I found, kind of so fascinating and hilarious was, how precise so many of these models were. As in like here you, not to rag on Nate Silver, but right, you're giving these probabilities to the decimal place, 71.4% she's going to win. And, New York Times at one point had 91% chance she's going to win. And of course, that's only one of the more memorable of a long line of modern forecasting failures. Of course, there was the financial crisis of 2008. And, now, of course, we can add much newer ones, such as, I feel like so many books to be written on COVID and COVID models, but we'll leave that to the side for now. And so, as I write, numbers still mislead, figures still deceive, and predictions still fail, sometimes spectacularly so, even those that rely on exceptionally sophisticated mathematics. So are the techniques being used today to parse and package quantitative information any more effective than what was devised by astrologers millennia ago? So that was sort of the launching off point for this project. And it was a very fun project. It was sort of originally conceived of as, hey, let's side by side compare astrological forecasting with modern, quote unquote scientific forecasting, with the goal of showing that modern scientific forecasting really tends not to be very good. But of course, in order to do that, this sort of precipitated a deep dive into what astrology is, and because of my interest, I was primarily interested in ancient astrology. One, that's again where my interests lie, and two, is my contention that ancient astrology was a very serious mathematical enterprise, and that modern astrology is extremely fascinating, but I sort of do subscribe to the theory that there's sort of a big break from ancient astrology to modern astrology that happens around the turn of the 20th century. And we sort of talk about that in my book, but probably not so much in this talk. So I and partly because I kind of just wanted to avoid the minefield of modern astrology, I didn't talk too much about modern astrology. I focus mostly on ancient astrology and ancient astrological algorithms. However, probably the reason I felt like I, maybe could approach this topic, well, one, I sort of had a sense of how modern forecasting works just, from my job, but I have a sort of lifelong fascination with the history of science, and particularly history of astronomy, and for I guess going on decades now, I've been one of those people who are fascinated by this specific astronomical instrument, which is called an astrolabe. And the one I'm showing here is actually the astrolabe that one of the astrolabes they have at the Smithsonian. And you can go to, sometimes it's on display, sometimes it's not. I never quite know, but you can go to the Smithsonian. And this particular astrolabe, it's believed, although you can never say for sure, but it's believed that this astrolabe was actually owned by Galileo. And so if I can, I'm going to try to show a different screen. Let's see if this works. Maybe Jeremy can guide me here. Let's see. Can I exit the sharing function?
Yeah, I think you can click it at the top. You should be able to.
Okay.
Or if it's on a website, I mean, it should allow you the option to.
All right. Let's share web browser. Let's try that. Okay. Can you see?
Yep, we can see the web page.
Cool. Okay, so this is actually something a site I've been developing for many years, and this is an online interactive version of an astrolabe. And so I've sort of been working on this with some of the folks at Oxford as a teaching aid, and I think that by going through this exercise, I've always been fascinated by astrolabes. By the way, this is sort of what an astrolabe nominally is supposed to show you. So here, this is of course the present moment. You can see the date. You can change your latitude. You can change where you are. And it basically is a model of the cosmos as it changes in time. Now we can also speed it up. And if we speed it up even more, we can really see the planets start to move. And so, people used to ask me, well, what does an astrolabe do? What is it good at? And of course, it's good at many things. It's sort of an all-purpose astronomical computer. Now, keep in mind that these things were invented in, just shortly after the time of Christ. They're a product of Greco-Roman Alexandria, so around the time of Ptolemy. So these instruments have been around for a long, long time. They're a wonderful astronomical calculating tool. They're a wonderful model of the cosmos that was extremely effective. But at some point, after many, many years of sort of, being versed in the sort of technical guts of these things, I came to the realization that the actual reason these things were as popular as they are, and these things lasted, well, as you saw, Galileo had one. These things lasted well into the scientific revolution. These things are the perfect instrument for astrology. In fact, in my book, I call these the astrology machine. And essentially, one of the things they do that would be extremely difficult without a device like this is they compute the rising times of different. They show you the rising times of different celestial bodies. How that was done would require a little bit of explanation, but you can see that if you were at this particular moment in time and I wanted to know when the moon was rising, this tells me exactly when it rises. Of course, I'm looking at, these things turn clockwise. This is, of course, I talk about this in the book too. This is the forerunner of modern clocks. So they turn clockwise because that's the way the heavens would turn if you imagine the Earth in the center. So we have nighttime, and then Jupiter would rise at this particular moment of the night, then followed by Mars, and it's you can also see. And this is actually fun because you can highlight different things. So these are the astrological houses of heaven. So in particular, it tells you a lot of information that is extremely useful for astrology. All right, so now I'm going to attempt to go back to sharing my presentation. All right, please let me know if that transition didn't work. So hopefully you can see my presentation. And
Yep, it's good. Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so it was because I'd spent so many years designing that online astrolabe, and I encourage you to go check it out. It's at my website is alexboxer.com, and the astrolabe's right there. I sort of felt like I had, a reasonable understanding of the technical computations of ancient astrology, and so that sort of began this process. So, and the way the book is structured, it's very, very difficult. Well, I guess it'd be impossible. From the outset, I had no intention of trying to write a comprehensive history of astrology. It's too much. It's too big. And so rather, the strategy I employed was something I guess I ended up calling a geologic survey approach, where I wanted to ask focused questions and explore them deeply in a few representative areas. And so each chapter of the book is devoted to a basic but honest technical question I had. And then each chapter focuses on the writings of usually just one author, sometimes a handful of authors. And the purpose of this was so that I would never be stuck making a sentence such as astrologers believe X. I don't want to generalize like that. It's too big of a topic with too many people. And it's usually the case that astrologers don't believe one specific thing. Whereas I could say, Ptolemy said this, or Guido Bonatti said this. And so that's, a statement I can get behind. So, each chapter also attempts to also look at the question using modern data. And the chapters are arranged chronologically, and the concepts build upon each other. And again, most of the chapters introduce a component of the astrolabe. So if you read the book from start to finish, that astrolabe that you saw, which undoubtedly looks very complicated, we try to explain it piece by piece. So to give you an example of the way, sort of organizing the book around questions, basic question I would have is, when did astrology begin? That's something I talk about in chapter 2. Chapter 3 sort of focuses on, how do you even draw the boundaries of the zodiac? What does it mean when people say there's 13 zodiac signs instead of 12? Other chapters that we have are, hey, what are some of these astrological stock picking algorithms that people developed? How do they work? And and then the last chapter, which I quite like, is what would a horoscope look like from another planet? What if you really do? And how did people conceive of this even several hundred years ago? So this is the way the book is set up, sort of run a series of questions. So here's one example. And this is the chapter where I talk about a very interesting astrologer who lived around the time of Ptolemy. So this is a couple hundred years after Christ in the Roman Empire, in particular in Greek-speaking Alexandria, Egypt. And his name's Vettius Valens, and he gives us the most comprehensive collection of horoscopes that survive from the ancient world, and they're very personal. They're personal horoscopes. They talk about these very real people, although their names are not given. It talks about what the heavens looked like at their birth, and what ended up happening to them. And so each chapter begins with an astrolabe style scheme of heaven. A scheme of heaven, of course, being another way of describing a horoscope, and that was where the title of the book comes from. So we do a scheme of heaven for a particular moment in time and space. And then, so the question was how many, this is sort of a fun question that I had never really seen addressed in another book. How many horoscopes are even mathematically possible? Well, of course, like everything, it depends on how you count. But using the way that this astrologer Vettius Valens defines a horoscope, where he lists not just where the sun is on your birthday, but where the sun, the moon, the rising sign, and the other planets were on your birthday. You can crunch the numbers and you get to about 45 million possibilities. So it's sort of more interesting than the idea of, hey, everyone just has one zodiac sign. I'm a Taurus, somebody else could be a Libra. And, that way, that you share your horoscope with 1 out of 12 people on the planet. Whereas, okay, if there's 45 million, that makes you a little bit more unique. But, you still probably share it with about 30,000 people. So these are sort of interesting questions that the book explores. And then a question that I also liked is, okay, computing your horoscope that way, how often do they repeat? And the answer is extremely rarely. And so that was actually very cool to think that the way the heavens are set up on your birthday, may have last occurred thousands of years ago. So here's a chart I made where we took every day of 1979 and mapped that day to some date in the past that was the most recent time that particular configuration occurred. And I just find a chart like this fascinating to see those lines fan out over thousands of years. So it turns out that for my specific birthday, which was May 18th, 1979, the last time that scheme of heaven would have occurred was in 2669 BC. So again, just trying to give an example of sort of the questions we ask in the book and sort of the techniques we sort of apply to answer them. But the example I wanted to talk about for this talk, I chose this because it seems a little bit more relevant to Washington, D.C., or at least also the Virginia suburbs of D.C. So this was a question where I wanted to ask, but where did the zodiac personality traits even come from? Those seem to be, one of the most basic elements of astrology. Where do they come from? And so this brings us back to ancient Rome. So a lot of my chapters actually take place around Roman times, and I think that one, that's sort of where my interests lie, but two, I don't think it's no accident. I am of the belief that astrology's sort of most interesting time period, and when it became extremely widespread, was during this time period. I think we tend to think of astrology as being kind of medieval, but really it's in the Roman Empire that astrology really has its heyday. Of course, it begins much earlier than that, begins in Babylon, sort of spreads throughout the Greek-speaking world, but it's really sort of in the Roman Empire where everything comes together and astrology really becomes part of the culture. And so this is, of course, the way the heavens looked at the assassination of Julius Caesar. And so we talk about this author named Marcus Manilius, who writes the first extended treatise we have on astrology. So that's a little surprising to say, but it's true. But although we know that astrology goes back to Babylonian times, and we certainly have evidence of astrology from that time in terms of clay tablets and other various records, as far as an extended description of astrology and how it works, you have to go all the way into Roman times, and it's not even in Greek. It's not in it's in Latin. It's this Latin poem, and Marcus Manilius is sort of, he's writing, at the time of Augustus and Tiberius, when astrology really becomes central to the functionings of the Roman Empire. Everyone's getting their horoscope cast. Everyone wants to know who is going to succeed who in power. At one point, I feel like astrology's emphasis or importance gets underlined in the most important way it can. It gets outlawed. The Emperor Augustus outlaws astrology at one point, in particular trying to predict when people are going to die. This is sort of what people are doing at this time, and astrologers sort of become integral to this sort of machinations and scheming of Roman politics. So I'm a huge fan of the series I, Claudius, and the key astrologer from this time is a character named Thrasyllus, and he and his son end up being the astrologers to the emperors for about 100 years. And so they give Thrasyllus a role in the show I, Claudius, which I highly recommend. But Manilius would have known all of these characters. He would have been in this circle. Oh, and of course, this is a famous coin of the Emperor Augustus, where he shows his zodiac sign as a Capricorn. He was a proud Capricorn, although he wasn't born at that time. Nobody can quite figure out why he was a Capricorn. Anyway, so Manilius gives the earliest description of the zodiac personality traits. And the traits are fairly straightforward. Generally, if you're born under a certain zodiac sun sign, you are believed to be suited for the professions that seem best for that creature, let's say. So, Aries are supposed to be, involved in wool trades and clothing. Tauruses, are supposed to be farmers, etc. So it's sort of a simplistic assertion of the zodiac personality traits, but it's nice because actually modern astrology makes a lot of claims that are hard to test sort of on purpose. They're sort of purposely slippery and a little bit wishy-washy, but in this text, the traits are very specific, and so that's fun because you can test them. So one of the ones that stood out to me was the idea that Libras, of course, make good lawyers and judges. And so I thought, oh, well, all right, this is something that we can sort of walk through the process of how would you analyze a claim like this. So the sample I chose were the US Supreme Court justices. So here are all of the zodiac signs in a histogram being essentially a bar chart like this of all of the Supreme Court justices at the time I wrote the book, which I think was Gorsuch was the last one, but so we've had two more since then. And so you don't really see a tendency to be Libras. You do see a lot of them being Pisces, but what does that really mean? How do you actually analyze a chart like this? And so I'm going to just read a section from the book. So this is actually a textbook case where a statistical inference test of the sort we introduced in chapter 1 can provide some much needed clarity. In fact, we can use one of the very first statistical tests ever devised, Carl Pearson's chi-squared test, which may be familiar to those who have taken a college level laboratory course. Pearson's test, which he refined throughout the 1890s, was initially applied to assess the fairness of coin flips, dice rolls, and famously the roulette tables of Monte Carlo, which he discovered weren't fair at all. In the amazing way in which mathematics often reveals that two seemingly dissimilar problems are actually the same, it turns out that our zodiac conundrum is mathematically identical to Pearson's question about the fairness of dice. So we sort of give a extremely brief. I've been criticized that the book is too complicated and that there's too many equations in the book. In fact, there are only 2 equations in the book, and this is one of them. So hopefully 2 equations isn't too much. But I sort of briefly go through how you would actually analyze something like this using a simple test, in this case, a simple chi-squared test. And so we go through the numbers, we get this number of 10. And it turns out the threshold for significance in a test like this is more like 20. And so we're well below that. So a value like ours, which is well below the threshold for significance, is pretty much the statistics way of saying, move along, there's nothing to see here. In other words, regardless of how our histogram may appear, the results are perfectly consistent with there being no correlation whatsoever between being a justice of the US Supreme Court and having any particular zodiac sign. So, that's sort of an example of how we, ask and answer some of these questions in the book. Now, I continue. This is a reassuring result. It would be bizarre and downright unfair if a job systematically favored some people over others simply because of when they were born during the year. And yet, as I discovered to my great surprise, this is exactly what happens in a number of professions, particularly in sports, and particularly those that rely on competitive youth leagues with strict age cutoffs. The most extreme case is hockey. So junior hockey leagues typically group players together according to the calendar year of their birth. This means that a player born on January 1st will be almost a full year older than his teammate born on December 31st, even though both belong to the same age cohort. For players who are 9 or 10 years old, that difference represents an enormous developmental advantage, both physically and mentally. And since only the best players from any given year are likely to continue on to the next level, the cumulative effect is a system that progressively weeds out Sagittarii, Scorpios, and Libras in favor of Capricorns, Aquarii, and Pisces, even before these players ever reach the pros. So it's an example of how I guess you don't quite need to believe in astrology to have astrology maybe point you in the direction that there's actually fascinating things that go on with, of course, seasonality. So this phenomenon is called the relative age effect, and it was noticed, maybe back in really not even before the 80s it was noticed in hockey. And yeah, in hockey really is there's charts in the book, but for hockey the seasonality really is pretty extreme. Yeah, if you're born in December, you're very unlikely to make it to the pros. So does the relative age effect show up anywhere outside of sports? The school year in most places has a fall cutoff, and some studies claim a bias can be found in academic achievement, job success, and a whole host of other metrics which ripple down through our lives. If so, then the effect is a small one. There are, to be sure, sophisticated statistical techniques that can be used to tease out small effects from data, but the results tend to be less persuasive. Personally, whenever I want to make a point with data, I try to keep in mind the maxim that, quote, if you need to use statistics, you probably should have designed a better experiment. In other words, for a truly compelling result, the data should tell their own story, one that leaps from the page with any complicated analysis. And this is a good way to introduce what I think is one of the most surprising and astonishing astrological results of all. It's not just a few professions, but our entire species, which exhibits an uneven distribution of zodiac signs. So here's actually just all US births, 1994 to 2014. And so what we see is an almost perfect, one might even say beautiful, sinusoid pattern that rises and falls from Leo to Capricorn. Remarkably, you don't get nearly so smooth a curve if you group the data by month. The calendar months are too choppy in their lengths and perhaps not arrayed as naturally throughout the year as the zodiac signs, which are pinned to the solstices and the equinoxes. It's only when the data are arranged astrologically that their story comes across so clearly. And what this story reminds us is that in spite of our modern technological lives, we are still creatures of the seasons, tuned to the rhythms of the sun. Creatures with a slight but unmistakable preference for having babies in the summer and evidently for making them in the fall. So yeah, we ended up looking at a number of sports. So you can see that relative age effect in baseball and football, but not in basketball. I also looked at Olympic sailors, and the reason I looked at sailors was again a Washington D.C. connection. So to conclude this chapter, I wrote that in the end, it seems that Manilius was onto something when he suggested that certain professions are linked with the zodiac. He appears to have been all wrong about the particulars, though, including when it comes to sports. So, I wasn't able to find anything that supported his specific claims, but the idea that there is a seasonal effect, of course, can be shown. But for instance, a sample of Olympic sailing medalists shows no correlation with Pisces or any other zodiac sign. Of course, Pisces being a fish, people born under Pisces, according to Manilius, are supposed to be good sailors and good swimmers. But even here, Manilius still manages to have the last words. Because if we were to conclude from this that Manilius's assertions about Pisces have no bearing on sailors and the art of navigation, we would not be totally correct. For it's Manilius's description of the profession of Pisces that was chosen to adorn the seal of the United States Naval Observatory. Ade guberandi studium pervenit astra et pontum caelo conjunxit. Then to the pilot's care the stars are scaled and sky with ocean joined. In other words, the institution that publishes each year's nautical and astronomical almanacs and which maintains the master clock for the entire GPS satellite navigation system has this entire time been operating under the subtle influence of an obscure ancient Roman astrologer. Just think about that the next time your phone or other GPS-enabled device successfully guides you from point A to point B. There's no magic involved, but there is perhaps a dash of astrology. So I don't quite know how I'm doing on time, but I will sum up with how I conclude the book, at least sort of how I conclude the book. So for all these reasons, it's no mystery to me why astrology provokes such sharp emotions. At stake is not so much which truth is true, but where we should seek our wonder. To acknowledge science as a source of wonder is to acknowledge implicitly a profound debt to history and also a profound responsibility. For if we cannot faithfully preserve the knowledge which previous generations have hewed out of bleakest ignorance, then we will squander wonder for the generations that follow. Nevertheless, and however well-meaning the motives, those who would amputate astrology from science's history or set it apart for ridicule do nothing to preserve science or its history. On the contrary, they are being deeply unfaithful to both. To tell a messier story of how we know is not to diminish what we know, but rather to appreciate it all the more as something at once more astonishing and more humbling.